For roughly 3 years, I worked as an overnight security officer at a sprawling two-story commercial shopping center on the outskirts of town. Originally, management didn't hire overnight personnel, but after a string of late-night break-ins and property damage, they created a graveyard shift. Most of my 8-hour shift involved idling in a patrol car, cruising around the expansive exterior parking lots, listening to talk radio and occasionally chasing off trespassing teenagers. For the most part, it was an incredibly quiet, monotonous job, until about 3 months into the position, when the dead silence of the night finally fractured, pulling me out of my safe routine into something I could never unsee. It was around 2 a.m., and I was making a routine loop near the south entrance when I noticed something bizarre. A bright, warm light was illuminating the display windows of an upscale jewelry boutique inside the concourse. I paused. The mall doors were locked, the exterior alarm panel was set, and no one had passed my vehicle all night. I parked the patrol cruiser near the main glass entrance, unlocked the side door, and stepped into the pitch-black, echoing mall concourse to hunt down what I assumed was a burglar. As I approached the jewelry shop, I kept my flashlight off, listening intently for the sound of shattering glass or rustling inventory. But the corridor was dead silent. When I reached the storefront, I was completely baffled. The heavy steel security gate was pulled down completely and padlocked tight to the floor. Only the shop's regional managers held keys to those gates. I didn't even have one on my master ring. I stared through the metal mesh. The interior shop lights were burning bright, but the space was entirely empty. Assuming an automated lighting timer had simply glitched, I turned around and walked back out to my patrol car. An hour passed without incident, but as I rounded the western quadrant near the department store anchor, another bright beam caught my eye through the glass. A second shop, a high-end apparel store 50 yards down from the jewelry shop, was now fully illuminated. I unlocked the concourse entrance and stepped back inside. Just like before, the store's heavy security gate was pulled completely shut and locked to the concrete floor. I walked right up to the mesh, grabbed the metal handles, and shook the gate, aggressively, shouting into the dark store to see if anyone was hiding behind the displays. No response. The metal frame rattled against the floorboards, echoing loudly down the dark, vacant concourse. Suddenly, a loud, distinct click echoed directly behind me. I spun around. Down the hallway, the lights inside the first store, the jewelry shop, had completely shut off, plunging that section of the corridor back into total darkness. I froze. I was operating on barely 3 hours of sleep over a 48-hour stretch, so I tried to convince myself my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But as I swept my flashlight beam across the dark storefront of the jewelry shop, I caught a sudden flash of movement behind the glass counter, a shadow dropping quickly to the floor, as if hiding from my light. My skin bristled with goosebumps. I raised my flashlight, aiming the beam directly at the counter, but saw nothing through the thick glass. Then right behind my head, a second loud click snapped through the silence. The apparel store lights directly in front of me instantly went out, throwing me into near-pitch blackness. I whipped my flashlight back around to the gate. Standing less than 3 feet away from me, on the inside of the locked security mesh, was the silhouette of a tall figure, standing perfectly motionless right beside the wall light switch. My voice trembled, but I tried to maintain authority. "You have 5 seconds to step into the light, or I am calling the police." The figure didn't move. It just stood right beside the toggle switch in the dark. I raised my high-powered flashlight and focused the beam directly on the switch panel. The space was completely empty. There was no one standing by the wall. A tall mannequin dressed in a winter coat was standing roughly 2 feet from the switch, casting a long, angular shadow against the paint when the overhead lights went out. I stood there in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs, staring at the empty space. I tried to tell myself it was just a shadow caught at a weird angle, combined with severe sleep deprivation. I left the concourse immediately and spent the rest of the night locked inside my patrol car. I never saw the lights switch off again, but for the remainder of my time on that job, I was fundamentally changed. I never stepped foot back inside that concourse alone after midnight. Working the graveyard shift at a massive commercial shopping center usually means a whole lot of nothing. For the past year, I felt entirely safe navigating the empty, sprawling complex during the freezing depths of January. It was just a routine job, monitoring the property, handling minor logs, and keeping the building secure. It was 3:30 a.m. and all I wanted was to finish checking the final set of climate control valves, so I could take a quick, quiet break before my shift ended. But nature called, and I decided to make a fast pit stop at the main public restroom near the food court. I pushed through the heavy wooden door into the cavernous, tiled room. That is when the absolute silence of the building was violently shattered. Flushes. My heart leaped straight into my throat. The mall automated motion sensor toilets should not have gone off with zero movement in the room. I shone my flashlight down the row of empty stalls, checking under every single door, but there was nothing. Figuring it was just a mechanical glitch, I brushed off the unease, walked into the very last stall, latched the door, and pulled out my phone for a quick breather. About 2 minutes in, reality froze. T-ep, tappa, tap. A soft, rhythmic tapping echoed from the metal partition wall right next to me. I dropped my phone and stared at the floor beneath the divider. Standing just inches away was a pair of dirty, oversized black work boots pointing straight at my door. My blood turned to ice. I had not heard a single footstep on the tile. Someone had walked in with unnatural silence, or had been waiting in the dark the entire time. With my chest pounding, I slowly tilted my head upward toward the top of the 7-foot metal partition. Peering down at me was the gaunt, skeletal face of a towering man. His eyes were wide, glassy, and completely unblinking, locking right onto mine. Before I could even scream, the man smoothly and silently dropped his head back down below the wall. Panic completely overrode my senses. I scrambled up, threw my weight against my door, and kicked open the adjacent stall. It was utterly empty. No man, no hiding place. Just that exact same pair of worn, filthy work boots sitting alone in the center of the floor, pointing directly at my wall. I did not investigate. I did not search the building. I turned on my heel, sprinted out of that restroom, burst through the service exit, and bolted straight to my patrol vehicle in the parking lot. I locked every door, kept the engine idling, and stared at the dark building until the morning cleaning crew finally arrived at 6 a.m. To this day, I have never stepped foot inside that restroom again. I still work security, but the comfort of the graveyard shift is gone forever. Because no matter how safe you think a locked building is, you never truly know who or what is sharing the dark with you. A few years ago, when I was 17, my friend Marcus and I decided to urban explore the famous abandoned North Country Mall site, a massive, decaying 2-story shopping complex that had been closed to the public for over a decade. It was a Wednesday night around 11 o'clock during summer break. We parked Marcus's hatchback a mile away in a residential neighborhood and crept up to the rear loading dock of the abandoned anchor store. We found an unlatched emergency exit door that previous trespassers had pried open with a crowbar, slipped inside, and pulled the metal frame shut behind us. Inside, the environment was hauntingly quiet and completely pitch black. We stood near the loading bay for a few moments, switching our flashlights off just to experience the crushing, absolute darkness of an abandoned megastructure. After taking it in, we clicked our flashlights back on and began exploring the lower level, navigating past collapsed drywall, broken glass, and stripped storefronts. We climbed up a frozen, rust-covered escalator to reach the second-floor concourse. As we were shining our narrow flashlight beams into the hollowed-out frames of old retail shops, a heavy metallic clang echoed from deep within the concourse ahead of us. I stopped dead in my tracks, grabbing Marcus's jacket sleeve. "Is that security?" I whispered frantically. Marcus shook his head, looking uneasy. "No way. Local cops don't patrol the inside of this place. It is probably just raccoons or other explorers." Despite his attempt to sound confident, we decided to play it safe. We switched off our lights to avoid revealing our position and began creeping backward down the dark corridor, keeping our hands pressed against the cold drywall to guide ourselves through the pitch black. We had just passed the dark threshold of an old department store when a second, far louder sound shattered the quiet, a heavy, resounding bang like a steel pipe hitting a concrete pillar. It was significantly closer than the first sound. Fearing someone was actively tracking us, Marcus and I stopped dead still in the dark. Suddenly, a faint, muffled whispering sound began echoing from the dark corridor directly in front of us. "Over here, hey, this way." The voice was low, raspy, and distorted by the heavy echo of the vast concourse. Assuming Marcus had walked a few steps ahead of me in the dark and was trying to guide me toward an exit corridor, I stepped toward the sound. The muffled voice kept repeating, "This way, keep coming." I shuffled forward through the pitch black, extending my hand into the empty air. "Marcus," I whispered softly, "which way are we going?" There was no verbal response, but my reaching hand brushed against the shoulder of a heavy jacket standing right in front of me in the dark. I reached out to grab my friend's coat, but the moment my fingers touched the material, my stomach dropped. Marcus had worn a smooth, thin nylon windbreaker that night. The material under my palm was thick, coarse, heavily matted canvas. Panicked, I clicked the power button on my tactical flashlight. The bright LED beam burst to life, illuminating the face of the person I was holding on to. Standing less than 6 inches from my face was a tall, gaunt man wearing a filthy ski mask and a heavy canvas coat. His bloodshot eyes were wide open, staring down at me with an intense, terrifying grin, visible beneath the mouth opening of the mask. Before I could even process what I was looking at, the man threw a thick arm around my neck, pulling me into a suffocating headlock and dragging me backward into the dark department store frame. I screamed, kicking wildly and striking his ribs. Out of the darkness behind us, Marcus suddenly appeared, wielding a heavy metal display rod he had picked up off the floor. Marcus swung the rod with everything he had, striking the man square across the shoulder. The man let out a sharp grunt of pain and loosened his grip just enough for me to slip free. "Run!" Marcus yelled. We sprinted through the pitch black, abandoning all caution, smashing through debris and sliding down the rusted escalator steps. We didn't stop, look back, or check to see if the man was following us. We threw open the unlatched emergency exit door, burst out into the cool night air, and ran the full mile back to Marcus's car without stopping. We threw our gear into the trunk, tore out of the residential neighborhood, and didn't utter a single word to each other until we were miles away on the interstate. To this day, I have no idea who that man was, how long he had been living in the pitch black ruins of that mall, or what he intended to do when he used that muffled voice to lure me right into his hands in the dark. I used to work the graveyard shift at a 24-hour convenience and arcade shop attached to a large regional shopping mall in coastal North Carolina. While the main shopping concourse locked its doors to the public at 9 p.m., our store remained open around the clock via an exterior entrance facing the main parking lot. However, because our shop shared an internal partition with the mall concourse, company policy required me to lower a heavy crisscross steel gate over our internal entrance every night at 9 p.m. sharply. Working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift in a small convenience shop was usually incredibly boring. On weeknights, I might see 3 or 4 customers over an entire 8-hour stretch. One rainy Tuesday night around 2:30 a.m., I was stocking inventory near the back of the store. Through the open mesh of the lowered steel security gate, I could look out into the dim, half-lit concourse of the closed mall. The mall management kept low emergency lights on overnight so the roving security guards could see down the hallways on their camera monitors. As I was organizing shelves, a sharp metallic rattle echoed from the internal gate. I turned around, assuming it was one of the mall overnight security officers stopping by to check on the store. But as I stepped toward the counter and called out, "Can I help you, officer?" I realized it wasn't a guard at all. Standing on the dark side of the locked security gate was a tall, disheveled man wearing a filthy flannel shirt and baggy jeans. He had both hands tightly gripping the steel mesh of the gate, shaking it back and forth. Most unsettling of all, he wasn't looking at me. His head was tilted completely backward, his throat exposed, staring rigidly up at the concrete ceiling tiles above his head. I took a slow step back toward the counter. "Sir, the mall is closed. You need to head out through the main exit doors." He ignored me entirely. He continued to violently shake the metal gate while keeping his eyes locked on the ceiling above him. Our store had an emergency protocol card posted near the register with a speed dial number for the mall security office. But I was new on the job. The ink on the laminated card was faded, and I could not figure out which button sequence routed to the security desk. Unsure of what else to do, I decided to pull back into the store. I turned my back on the gate and retreated behind the main register counter, keeping as much distance between us as possible. The layout of our aisles was perpendicular to the front counter, meaning I had a direct, unobstructed line of sight out toward the steel gate. I watched from behind the counter as the man finally let go of the metal mesh. He began walking backward away from our shop into the dark mall concourse, never lowering his head, keeping his face turned completely toward the ceiling tiles until he vanished into the shadows. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the encounter. I assumed a security guard would spot him on the concourse cameras eventually and escort him off the property. 10 minutes passed. Suddenly, the chime on our exterior parking lot door rang as the automatic glass door slid open. I could not see the entrance from my position behind the aisle shelves, so I waited for the customer to bring their items up to the counter. When a few minutes passed and no one approached, I walked around the counter to check the aisles. Standing at the far end of the beverage aisle was a man. His back was turned to me, and his head was tilted all the way back, staring directly at the fluorescent lighting track on the ceiling. At first, I thought he was looking for a specific brand on the top shelf, but as I took a step closer, my stomach plummeted into a cold pool of dread. He was wearing the same baggy jeans, but he had removed his flannel shirt entirely, standing bare-chested in the aisle. Hearing my footsteps, the man slowly rotated his body around to face me. He didn't drop his head immediately. He lowered his gaze until his eyes locked directly onto mine. His face was contorted into a wide, unnatural, ear-to-ear smile. It wasn't a friendly grin, it was a wide, manic, unblinking grimace, like something out of a nightmarish fever dream. We stood there in total silence for what felt like an eternity, staring at each other across the aisle. I was paralyzed with absolute terror. The sheer malice and instability radiating from his face rendered me completely unable to speak or move. Finally, I managed to choke out a trembling, terrified sentence. "Get out, leave right now, or I am calling the police." He didn't blink. He didn't drop the wide, hideous smile. He didn't make a single sound. Panic completely overtook me. I turned around, sprinted into the employee break room at the back of the store, slammed the heavy metal door, and threw the lock. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely punch my manager's cell number into my phone. I called her 4 times, but she didn't answer. I sat crouching in the corner of that break room for 10 agonizing minutes, trembling in complete silence, terrified he was going to try to kick the door down. Then right beside my head, a soft, gentle tap echoed against the wood of the break room door. Tap. Just one light, deliberate finger tap against the frame. I held my breath, pressing my hand over my mouth to silence my breathing. I sat in that back room for another 20 minutes, too terrified to move. Eventually, the fear of getting fired for abandoning the register outweighed the immediate terror. I unlocked the break room door, cracked it open, and swept the store with a heavy metal fire extinguisher in hand. The shop was empty. He was gone. When the morning shift arrived at 7 a.m., my manager finally answered her phone. We pulled up the store security camera footage from the night shift. The cameras caught the entire sequence. The man walking into the store, removing his shirt, staring at the ceiling, standing at the end of the aisle, smiling at me, and walking up to the break room door to gently tap on the frame before casually walking out the front exit into the night. My manager was visibly horrified by the footage and filed a police report immediately. I put in my 2-week notice that very afternoon and never worked an overnight retail shift ever again. Working as a cemetery superintendent for nearly 8 years changes your perspective on life and death. Most people assume it is a quiet job consisting of nothing more than mowing grass and preparing burial sites. But in reality, it involves meeting grieving families, helping arrange funeral services, and making sure everything runs without problems. After a while, you become used to sadness. But what you never get used to are the moments you can never truly explain. One afternoon in late spring, I met a man named Miguel who looked to be in his early 40s, soft-spoken and completely exhausted because his father had just been placed into hospice care. Miguel sat across from me, clutching a weathered envelope filled with paperwork, pulling out photographs every few minutes to ask about burial options. His father looked healthy in the older pictures, with a broad smile and silver hair. We spent nearly 2 hours choosing a gravesite beneath an old maple tree near the eastern section of the cemetery. And before leaving, Miguel thanked me for my patience. 3 days later, the funeral took place under dark and rain-filled skies while thunder rolled in the distance. As the procession prepared to leave, Miguel gave me a tired wave, and I headed back toward the administration office as the clock ticked past 5:30 in the evening. Rain was falling steadily, turning the evening completely dark. Part of my nightly routine involved driving every roadway one final time to ensure all visitors had gone home. But that night was entirely different. As I rounded a bend near the older headstones, my headlights briefly illuminated someone walking quickly between the monuments. The figure wore a long, dark coat and disappeared behind a tall hedge before I could get a good look. I tapped my horn 2 times and called out through the open window that we were closed, but received no response. Stepping out into the pouring rain with my flashlight, I searched every nearby tree and maintenance shed, but found absolutely no one, as if the person had simply vanished into thin air. Convinced I had only mistaken a shadow for a person, I returned inside to review security camera footage, though the storm made every lens useless. About 20 minutes later, a loud slam echoed through the building from the visitation room door. I froze, hurrying into the lobby to check, but found the front entrance locked and every hallway completely empty. That was when I noticed movement outside one of the large front windows. Someone was standing only a few feet away, completely motionless and unblinking. As the porch light caught his face, my blood ran cold because I recognized him instantly from Miguel's photographs. It was Miguel's father, featuring the same silver hair, gentle eyes, and wearing his favorite green and black plaid jacket. Stumbling backward in sheer terror, I rushed outside into the rain, but the sidewalk and parking lot were completely deserted, with no footprints anywhere. Later, when Miguel returned a week later to finish paperwork for his memorial marker, I asked him about the plaid jacket, and his stomach-dropping expression mirrored mine when he confirmed it was the exact jacket they had buried his father in. I still manage that same cemetery today, overseeing maintenance crews and welcoming visitors, but things have fundamentally changed. I have seen grieving families, wild animals, and occasional trespassers after dark, but none of those compare to what happened that stormy night. Now, every time a storm rolls in near closing time, I catch myself looking toward the front window, waiting patiently just in case someone is standing out there in the dark, watching as if they never really left. I grew up in a small mill town where almost everything looked forgotten. Brick storefronts sat empty, streetlights flickered more often than they worked, and some of the neighborhoods hadn't changed in decades. If you drove around long enough, you'd find abandoned factories, boarded-up churches, and more than a few places people insisted were haunted. One October night, my best friend Tyler and I were looking for something to do after midnight. We'd spent hours driving aimlessly with heavy rock music blasting through the speakers, stopping for snacks and wasting gas because neither of us wanted to go home. Eventually, Tyler pointed toward the oldest part of town. "You ever been inside the cemetery over there?" he asked. I knew exactly which one he meant. Behind the historic courthouse sat a massive cemetery that had been there since the early 1800s. Most people visited the newer section near the entrance, but farther back was an older portion surrounded by a rusted iron fence. The graves there belonged to families whose names had long disappeared from the town. People avoided that section. Naturally, that made us want to explore it. We parked along a side street and climbed over the waist-high fence without much effort. The difference between the two sections was immediate. The newer graves were clean and organized. The older cemetery felt abandoned. Many of the headstones leaned at odd angles. Moss covered the names, and tree roots pushed through cracked pathways that hadn't been maintained in years. Massive oak trees blocked out most of the moonlight, making the entire place feel darker than it should have been. Neither of us believed in ghosts. We laughed while trying to read dates carved into stones that were nearly impossible to make out. We wandered for almost an hour, taking pictures and joking about how every horror movie seemed to start exactly like this. Eventually, we found an enormous oak tree near the center of the old cemetery. Its branches stretched across several rows of graves, and the roots twisted through the ground like giant snakes. We sat beneath it to take a break. The night was completely still. No wind, no traffic, not even insects. Then we heard it. A little girl laughing. It sounded close, really close. The laugh lasted only a couple of seconds before everything became silent again. Tyler looked at me. "You hear that?" I nodded. At first, we assumed someone had left one of those electronic toys on a child's grave. Some toys play sounds when they're bumped or when the batteries start dying. That explanation made enough sense. Until the laugh came again. This time it sounded farther away, almost like whoever had made it was moving through the cemetery. Tyler stood up and swept his flashlight across the graves. "Nothing. No one's out here," he muttered. I tried to laugh it off, but something felt wrong. The silence afterward was almost heavier than before. That's when I noticed the feeling. You know that sensation when someone is watching you? Not just looking in your direction, actually staring. I couldn't shake it. I kept turning around, expecting to find another person standing nearby. Every time, there was nothing. Tyler suddenly froze. "What?" I asked. He didn't answer. He kept shining his flashlight toward a patch of woods bordering the cemetery. "What do you see?" "I thought," he whispered. "I thought someone stepped behind that tree." I looked where he was pointing. The flashlight reflected off dozens of thin tree trunks. Nothing moved. We both stood there quietly. Then the little girl laughed again. Only this time, it came from inside the woods. Almost immediately after the laughter stopped, we heard footsteps. Not running, walking. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Leaves compressed under someone's feet. Slow, steady, coming toward us. We couldn't see anyone. The flashlight beams reached only a short distance into the trees before disappearing into darkness. The footsteps kept getting closer. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Tyler grabbed my arm. "We're leaving." Neither of us argued. The moment we started walking away, the footsteps matched our pace. When we walked faster, they did too. Then the laughing returned. Only now it sounded much closer. Close enough that I instinctively looked over my shoulder. No one. The laughter stopped. The footsteps didn't. They kept following us between the graves. Without saying another word, we both broke into a run. Our flashlights bounced wildly as we sprinted downhill toward the fence we'd climbed earlier. The footsteps behind us became faster. Whatever or whoever was making them sounded like it was running now. I never looked back. I was too afraid of what I might see. The laughter echoed again, except it no longer sounded like a child. It sounded older, like someone trying to imitate one. We scrambled over the fence so fast I tore my jeans on one of the rusted spikes. Tyler reached the truck a second before I did. He fumbled the keys twice before finally unlocking the doors. The instant we climbed inside, everything went quiet. No footsteps, no laughter, nothing. Neither of us spoke as we sped away. About 5 minutes later, we stopped at the only 24-hour gas station in town. We were both breathing hard, trying to convince ourselves we'd let our imaginations get the better of us. Tyler walked around the truck and suddenly stopped. "Dude!" I stepped out. The rear passenger door was hanging open. Neither of us had opened it all night. Tyler slammed it shut without saying a word. As I reached for the handle, I noticed something on the seat inside. A tiny, muddy footprint. Bowery, no larger than a toddler's foot. We stared at it for several seconds. Neither of us said what we were both thinking. I checked the rest of the truck. There was nobody hiding inside. No toys, no prank, nothing that explained the footprint. The next morning, I convinced myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe one of us had accidentally left the door unlatched. Maybe the footprint had been there for weeks. Maybe we'd scared ourselves into imagining the laughter. A few days later, Tyler called me. Without saying hello, he asked one question. "Did you ever post those pictures from the cemetery?" I told him I hadn't. "I finally looked through mine," he said quietly. "Delete yours." "Why?" "There was somebody standing behind us." I laughed nervously. "You're messing with me." "I'm not." He sent me one of the photos. It showed the giant oak tree where we'd been sitting. Tyler and I were in the foreground. Behind us, between two crooked headstones, stood the faint outline of a little girl. She wasn't blurry. She wasn't transparent. She looked completely real, except for one thing. She had no face. Tyler deleted every picture before I could ask him to send the rest. I never went back to that cemetery. Neither did he. To this day, if I hear a child laughing when no children are around, every hair on the back of my neck stands up. Because for one night, something laughed at us from the darkness. And whatever it was followed us all the way to the truck. When I was 20, one of my closest friends, Ethan, had a habit of turning bad ideas into unforgettable nights. One Friday evening in late September, he showed up at my apartment with a grin that usually meant trouble. "I found a place you've got to see," he said. When I asked what kind of place, he told me it was an old family cemetery outside of town. I laughed, thinking that was his big plan, but he insisted it wasn't like a normal cemetery and that hardly anybody knew it was there anymore. Against my better judgment, I agreed. About 30 minutes later, we were driving along a narrow county road surrounded by farmland. As the sun disappeared behind the hills, the sky turned a deep orange before fading into gray. Eventually, Ethan slowed beside a crumbling stone wall, nearly hidden by overgrown weeds. There wasn't a sign, no parking lot, just an old iron gate hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Beyond it sat a tiny cemetery with maybe 80 or 90 graves. Most of the headstones leaned sideways, worn smooth by decades of rain. Towering pine trees surrounded nearly every side of the property, leaving the place in shadow long before darkness settled over everything else. "This is it," Ethan said proudly. I remarked that it looked abandoned, to which he replied, "Exactly." We climbed over the low wall instead of opening the gate. The air inside immediately felt colder. Not freezing, just different. Neither of us mentioned it. We wandered between the graves, reading names that dated back to the mid-1800s. Many stones had cracked completely in half, while others had become so weathered they looked like ordinary pieces of rock. The cemetery couldn't have been much larger than a football field. Beyond the far edge stood an old brick building with most of its windows boarded shut. When I asked what it was, Ethan said he had no clue. It looked too small to have been a church and too isolated to be someone's home. Nature had almost reclaimed it. Vines climbed its walls, the roof sagged, and several windows were broken, leaving dark openings that seemed to swallow the evening light. I couldn't stop looking at it. Something about the place felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. Ethan asked if I thought anyone still owned it, and I told him I hoped so. He laughed, saying he kind of wants to look inside. I shook my head immediately, asking if he was serious, because if someone was living there, we were trespassing. He dismissed this, doubting anybody's lived there in years, and started walking toward it before I could argue further. I stayed behind near one of the larger monuments. The silence around me became almost unbearable. No birds, no insects, even the breeze had disappeared. It felt as though the entire cemetery was holding its breath. That's when I noticed movement in one of the upstairs windows. Someone was standing there. At first I thought it was just my reflection. Then the figure shifted. An older man with a gray beard and a dark jacket stared directly at me through the dirty glass. Neither of us moved. After several seconds, he slowly stepped backward into the darkness. I called out to Ethan, but he didn't hear me. He had already disappeared around the side of the building. I hurried after him but stopped halfway when a loud crack echoed through the trees, sounding like a heavy branch snapping. I spun toward the woods. Standing just inside the tree line was the same older man. Only now he wasn't inside the building. He stood perfectly still with his hands at his sides. I couldn't understand how he'd gotten there so quickly. Then he yelled to get out! The words exploded through the cemetery. Birds burst from the treetops and the shout echoed across the entire property. I froze. Every instinct told me to run. Instead, I stood there staring at him. His expression wasn't angry, it was terrified. Like he wasn't warning us away from him, he was warning us about something else. The next thing I remember is waking up flat on my back. My head throbbed, and everything around me spun. Someone was dragging me by my jacket. It was Ethan. What happened? I gasped. He told me I passed out and urged me to just move. He practically pulled me across the grass toward the stone wall. Behind us came slow footsteps. Not running, walking, deliberate. I looked over Ethan's shoulder. The old man was following us. His face hadn't changed, he still looked frightened. Not threatening, just scared. Hurry, Ethan shouted. He shoved me over the wall before climbing over himself. We sprinted toward the car. As Ethan unlocked the doors, I looked back one final time. The old man hadn't crossed the wall. He remained standing inside the cemetery, watching the woods behind us instead of watching us. We sped away without saying a word. It wasn't until several miles later that Ethan finally spoke. I got inside the building, he said. I turned toward him. There wasn't any furniture. I asked what was in there. He swallowed hard and replied, the floor. He went on to describe how somebody painted a giant circle across the middle of the room. He described faded symbols surrounding it, melted candles scattered everywhere, and dozens of handmade dolls hanging from the ceiling. Each doll had its mouth stitched shut with black thread. There were hundreds of them. I thought it was some teenagers messing around, he said. Then I heard that man scream. When I asked if he chased him, Ethan shook his head. No. He ran inside. I was confused. What? He continued. He wasn't chasing me. He was running toward the building. I stared at him. I looked back before I came to get you. His voice had become almost a whisper. There was someone else in there. He claimed he'd only seen the figure for a second. It was a person standing perfectly still in the center of the painted circle. Exceptionally tall, too tall. Its head nearly touched the ceiling. It never moved. It simply watched him from across the room. The old man had been running toward it, not toward us. The following weekend, curiosity got the better of me. I drove back during the middle of the afternoon. The cemetery was exactly where we'd left it, but the brick building wasn't. Only its cracked concrete foundation remained. The entire structure had been demolished. There were no construction vehicles, no fresh tire tracks, no piles of lumber, nothing. It looked as though the building had been gone for years. I eventually found a maintenance worker trimming grass nearby and asked him what had happened to it. He frowned, asking, "What building?" I told him, "The old brick one next to the cemetery." He looked toward the empty field and said, "Son, there hasn't been a building there in at least 20 years. I never argued with him. Maybe Ethan and I found the wrong place. Maybe we somehow imagined the whole thing. Or maybe the old man wasn't trying to throw us out. Maybe he was risking his own life to keep two curious idiots from walking into something they were never supposed to find." Losing my grandfather was the hardest goodbye I have ever had to say. He was not just my grandpa, he was the person who taught me how to fish, helped me fix my first car, and somehow always knew exactly what to say whenever life was not going my way. Even after I moved into my own apartment an hour away, we still talked almost every week. When he passed away after a long illness, my entire family took it hard. A few months later, on what would have been his birthday, I decided to visit his grave by myself. The rest of my family had gone earlier that morning, but I had to work, so I made the drive alone that afternoon. It rained nearly the entire way. The kind of cold, steady rain that never lets up. By the time I reached the cemetery, the sky had turned a dull gray, making everything feel quieter than usual. The grounds were enormous, with rolling hills stretching in every direction, broken only by rows of polished headstones and clusters of old maple trees. At the entrance, the attendant asked for my grandfather's section number before waving me through. I had only visited once before, and someone else had been driving, so it took me several minutes to find the right place. There were not many visitors. In fact, I only noticed one other car the entire time I was there. Eventually, I found his grave. I parked nearby, grabbed the flowers I had brought, and walked over. His headstone was still spotless, meaning someone from my family had clearly visited recently. I knelt down, brushed away a few wet leaves, and placed the flowers in front of the stone. For several minutes, I simply stood there and talked to him quietly in my head. I thanked him for everything he had done for me growing up and apologized for not visiting more often. Then I closed my eyes for a moment. When I opened them again, someone was standing several rows away. An older man. His posture, his build, even the way he folded his hands in front of him. For one impossible second, I could have sworn it was my grandfather. He was not smiling. He was simply watching me. I blinked and the figure was gone. I looked around, expecting to see someone walking between the graves, but there was nothing. There was not anywhere he could have disappeared that quickly. I stood there another minute, trying to convince myself grief was playing tricks on my mind, and eventually I whispered that I loved him before heading back to my car. The drive home began normally. The rain had finally slowed to a drizzle, and the roads were nearly empty. About 20 minutes later, I turned onto a narrow two-lane road that cut through a heavily wooded area. As I rounded a bend, I noticed someone standing on the shoulder ahead, an older man with his hands in his pockets, looking toward the road. My chest tightened. The closer I got, the more familiar he looked. Gray hair, a dark jacket, the exact same face I thought I had seen at the cemetery. Without thinking, I jerked the steering wheel. My tires slipped on the wet pavement, and for a terrifying few seconds, I lost control of the car. It spun halfway across the road before finally stopping sideways. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I forced myself to look back toward the shoulder, but there was no man. Only a large deer standing perfectly still among the trees, staring at me for several seconds before slowly walking into the woods. I sat there for nearly 5 minutes before I could calm down enough to drive again. The rest of the trip home felt wrong. Not frightening exactly, just unsettling, like I was not alone. That night I went to bed earlier than usual, hoping sleep would clear my head. Around 2 a.m., my phone rang with an unknown number. Normally, I ignore calls that late, but something made me answer. When I said hello, there was nothing except faint static. I waited, and just as I was about to hang up, I heard what sounded like someone breathing, slow and steady. Then through the interference, a voice. It lasted less than a second, too distorted to understand clearly, but it sounded unbelievably familiar. My grandfather had a habit of ending every phone call the same way, telling me to take care of yourself. For just a moment, I thought I heard those exact words. Then the line went dead. I immediately called the number back, but it would not go through, disconnecting every time. The next morning, my phone provider confirmed a call had reached my phone during the night, but they could not identify where it came from, showing no originating number, just an incomplete connection. I tried to move on, and eventually life returned to normal, or at least it seemed to. About 6 months later, my grandmother invited me over for dinner, and while helping her organize old family photo albums, I found one I had never seen before. Inside were dozens of photographs taken long before I was born. One picture caught my attention immediately because it showed my grandfather standing beside another man, and they looked almost identical with the same height, same eyes, and same smile. When I asked who it was, my grandmother looked down at the picture and said softly that it was my great-uncle Daniel. I told her I had never heard of him, and she explained that he had passed away before my grandfather and I even got married. I looked back at the photograph. The man was not wearing the clothes I had seen, but the face was undeniable. It was not my grandfather after all. It was his older brother, the exact same brother whose grave was buried only 5 rows away from my grandfather, which was the exact spot where I had seen the older man standing that rainy afternoon. I never told my grandmother what happened that day because she would have thought grief had gotten the better of me, and maybe she would have been right. But every year on my grandfather's birthday, I still bring flowers. And before I leave, I always place one flower on his brother's grave too. Because whether I imagined him or not, it feels wrong not to. When I was 17, my friends and I thought we were invincible. If someone told us a place was haunted, we would make plans to go there that same night. Looking back, most of the things we did were unbelievably stupid, but at the time we thought fear was just another form of entertainment. It was the weekend before Halloween when my friend Dylan texted me to meet at his house with an idea. By 11 p.m. that night, the three of us, Dylan, Mason, and I, were piled into an old pickup truck with nowhere in particular to go. After driving around for nearly an hour, Dylan pointed toward a narrow road on the edge of town, asking if we knew the old abandoned cemetery behind the burned-down church. People rarely visited anymore, which of course made us want to go. We parked several hundred feet away to keep the truck hidden. The iron gate had been chained shut long ago, but a section of fencing had collapsed enough for us to squeeze through. The moment we stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop just enough for all of us to notice. Rows of old granite headstones disappeared beneath weeds, while thick vines wrapped themselves around cracked monuments that had stood there for generations. Moonlight filtered through the branches overhead, creating strange moving shadows. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. We wandered around reading names and guessing how old some of the graves were, finding markers dating back to the 1840s. Then a sharp tap knocked against a nearby headstone. We all stopped talking. Another tap echoed from somewhere behind us. I turned my flashlight toward the sound but saw nothing. A few minutes later, I decided to record a short video for fun, sweeping the camera across several old graves before stopping near a large angel statue with one wing missing. As I lowered my phone, I noticed someone standing beside the statue, a woman wearing a pale gray dress that hung almost to the ground. Her long dark hair covered most of her face and she was not moving. I lowered my phone to apologize, assuming she had wandered into my frame, but there was nobody there. I raised the phone again and she was back, standing in exactly the same spot. I called Dylan and Mason over. Within seconds, all three of us were staring at the same impossible image because the woman only existed inside the camera screen, not with our own eyes. The woman slowly lifted her head, her face looking blurred and incomplete. Then she took a step, gliding forward without her feet moving. Each time I blinked, she seemed several feet closer, with no footsteps and no sound. Panic set in. My phone vibrated and the camera app crashed into blackness. For a second, I saw only my own reflection, followed by a photo I had never taken. It showed the three of us standing exactly where we were, captured from behind as if someone had been watching us the entire time. Before I could answer Dylan, the picture disappeared, the camera reopened by itself, and the woman was gone. We did not wait to see what happened next. We ran through the overgrown cemetery, pushing past branches until we reached the truck and drove away in total silence. The mysterious photo was gone from my gallery, replaced only by a single blurry image that looked completely black at first. When I increased the brightness later that night, I noticed three faint figures standing among the graves facing the camera, with the woman standing right behind us. Someone had taken the picture from several yards away, meaning whatever captured it had been watching us the entire time. I still have that old phone today. Every few years I plug it in, hoping maybe I imagined everything, but the photo is still there exactly as I remember it. I only know one thing now. If you ever find yourself exploring an abandoned cemetery at night, do not look at it through your camera lens, because you might see someone looking back.